It's a pleasure to introduce John Dunne in the flesh. I've spent so many hours on Skype with him over the last several years that it's a unique pleasure to be in the same physical world. John is just received an endowed chair at the University of Wisconsin. What department? Is it in religious studies? What is Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, and half in East Asian languages. So congratulate John. He got the award letter yesterday. So John is a veteran of this type of meeting, of this kind of dialogue. We met many years ago under the auspices of Mind and Life. And he's going to speak further about heuristics of mindfulness.
So I'm actually going to, in a way, I'm going to give two talks. I'm going to talk about two different projects I'm involved in that are very closely related. One of them is a project that emerges in conversation with many people, including Jon Kabat-Zinn, but it's one that I've just written up myself. And another is the one that Cliff was talking about, where we spent many hours, I looked back at some files, more than 2 years, working on, almost 3 years actually, working on this project. So I'm really going to be talking about both of them, and they both can be conceptualized as heuristics. And they both come out of some issues around obstacles to research, and I think one fundamental obstacle we have is that we do not know what mindfulness is, and especially we use that plural, in other words, as a community of researchers working on mindfulness, we often disagree about what we mean by mindfulness. And I think some of this is also another obstacle in this regard, is that we almost always assume that mindfulness is one thing, that there's just one version of mindfulness. And also, interestingly, especially in scientific publications, Buddhist sources are frequently deployed, and I would say, with apologies, in a pretty muddled fashion, as authorities for what that one thing is. And I would call that authentic Buddhist mindfulness. So there's some authentic Buddhist mindfulness that we can derive from Buddhist sources, and there's only one version of it. And what I would say is that what we need are ways to conceptualize the various styles of mindfulness in different domains. We need a sort of social one that has been discussed already. I'm going to talk about two different domains. One of them is really parsing contemplative styles and theories. Basically, what do the Buddhist sources say about mindfulness? Those are not the only ones that are relevant to understanding mindfulness, but that's what one of my projects is. Then also talking about the phenomenology of different styles of mindfulness. And these would be understood to be heuristics that are embedded in, that would be used along with other heuristics around, let's, for example, say the way in which mindfulness creates a sense of an in-group. Now, these are the seven features of mindfulness according to Jon Kabat-Zinn in his original volume, Full Catastrophe Living. And we have non-judging patience, beginner's mind, trust, non-striving, acceptance, and letting go. These all then are sort of redescribed in what John calls an operational definition in 1994, when he says paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And this kind of definition, this sort of twin set of features, and then that definition, along with some instructions for practice, are what have become the subject of considerable critique, especially in recent years. But first, before I go on to discuss some of those critiques and the problems I see with them, and why we need to respond with a heuristic, I want to clarify something, which is that when I'm talking about mindfulness here, and I think when John is presenting, although I was just in conversation with him and I forgot to ask him about this, but I think really that definition and those features of mindfulness are coming out primarily of the context of formal meditation practice. And the idea that there's a distinction between formal meditation practice and what occurs in between meditation practice is implicit in most traditions, but it's very implicit in some of the traditions that I work with, especially the Tibetan traditions, the idea in Tibetan of what's called the Nyamshak and the Jetop. So what occurs during formal sessions is crucially important, between formal sessions rather, is crucially important, but it's usually quite distinct, especially for beginners, to what you are doing in formal meditation practice. And what I'm going to be focusing on right now is understanding what we mean by mindfulness during formal practice. Now, some of the main critiques of MBSR is basically that MBSR does not align with authentic, authoritative Buddhist sources that teach authentic Buddhist mindfulness. That's one critique. Another critique is that authentic Buddhist mindfulness requires one to make judgments, especially ethically charged judgments about one's mental states, and MBSR doesn't do that because it's non-judgmental. And the third is that authentic Buddhist mindfulness, or there's the acronym if you like, it also requires one to see things as they truly are, which has only one interpretation in Buddhism. So these second and third critiques in particular are basically a critique about the incapacity for moral or ethical judgment in the context of mindfulness and MBSR. And the third one is the lack of sort of insight of the wisdom, what the Buddhists would call the wisdom component in MBSR. Now, many of these come through an appeal to authority. Here's one of my favorite versions of that. The modern description and practice of mindfulness are certainly valuable, as thousands of people have discovered for themselves through their own practice. But this doesn't take away from the fact that the modern understanding departs significantly from the Buddha's own account of sati and from the most authoritative commentators in the Theravada and Indian Mahayana traditions. And this was written by Alan Wallace back in 2006. So this critique, this type of critique is, as you can see, a critique that says that there is a version of mindfulness, that's the authoritative version, which is essentially what the Buddha taught. And I see Bob Scharf in the front row smiling because we, who are trained in the academic study of religion, find this type of argument very familiar, but also extremely problematic. So the first counter-critique I would offer to this type of critique is that how do we know exactly what the Buddha taught? The very notion that the Buddha actually taught the sati that we speak of now is highly problematic. And the notion that there's only one version of it is likewise problematic. In other words, that there's only one set of authorities with one voice speaking. This is a very problematic way to think about Buddhism, at least from the standpoint of the academic study of Buddhism. Here's another critique of those three that I mentioned, a citation from Shonen, Van Gordon, and Griffiths, who have written a number of pieces that are fairly critical of certain aspects of modern mindfulness, including MBSR. The term non-judgmental, as you remember, one of the 7 descriptors of mindfulness, could also imply that the mindfulness practitioner does not seek to discern which cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses are conducive to the upholding of ethical commitments and to spiritual development in general. This would obviously be inconsistent with the Buddhist perspective. Well, as it turns out, that is incorrect. It is not inconsistent with the Buddhist perspective. It is inconsistent with a Buddhist perspective. But there are other Buddhist perspectives which explicitly say that during formal meditation, if you are engaged in ethical judgment, you are not doing the practice correctly. You have to abandon all ethical judgment during formal meditation practice. That would be, for example, in the Chagzok traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, the non-dual traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And then finally, this is from Ron Purser, who writes a very strong critique recently of mindfulness, of modern mindfulness, especially MBSR. He says, speaking about seeing things as they truly are, in a Buddhist context, this seeing things as they truly are refers to penetrating insight into the 3 characteristics. That would be selflessness, suffering, and impermanence, and a complete dissolution of the observer-observed dichotomy. Now, as it turns out, what's very interesting about this quote is it makes a unity out of something that is actually historically a disunity. If you are talking about a complete dissolution of the observer-observed dichotomy, you can't make a judgment about the 3 marks, according to Buddhist philosophy. If you're making a judgment about the 3 marks, you have to have an observer-observed dichotomy. So, as you can see, this particular quote is very interesting because it creates a kind of false unity which we are tending to do about the Buddhist tradition. And of course, the tradition does that itself to a certain extent. So just to review very quickly, we do not know what the Buddha said. The Buddhist traditions are not unitarian. Their texts do not always align with actual practice. Authentic Buddhist mindfulness, therefore, makes no sense. Some practice styles explicitly suspend ethical judgment during formal practice, so the idea that you have to engage in ethical judgment during formal practice is simply incorrect. And third, seeing things as they truly are occurs in various distinct ways that need to be kept separate. Finally, MBSR is much closer to what I would call non-dual styles, but most of these current critiques are coming from classical styles, which would include, for example, the various Theravada traditions. This then brings me then to a quick plug for this This is coming out of the first heuristic that I want to refer to. It's a heuristic which divides Buddhist styles of mindfulness into non-dual and classical styles. It's forthcoming. It should actually appear, I think, in August from Springer, which means that it'll be written on gold with lapis lazuli ink and cost $5 million. So download the PDF somewhere. So I hope Springer didn't hear that. Never mind. This is a table from that article, and this is from the proofs of that article, which actually talks about some of these distinctions. And this is a heuristic again, because it's not meant to say this is the only way of understanding these traditions, but this is a way of understanding the distinction among these traditions that is useful for examining the way in which we practice mindfulness. So, for example, classical traditions will always have an object of some kind, even if that object is just the field of consciousness itself. That ethical judgment has to occur in classical traditions, for example, classical Theravada, that conceptual schemas have to be deployed, and that you're not really fully present-centered precisely because you are retaining conceptual schemas and recollection of vows and so on. Whereas non-dual traditions paradigmatically are striving toward the abandonment of any focus on object. They require the suspension of ethical judgment for reasons I won't go into, but very briefly, it's about the connection between agency, selfhood, and concepts. All conceptual schemas have to be suspended for the same set of reasons, and as a way of blocking conceptuality, you remain present-centered. So that's just one heuristic that is a way of dividing up the different versions of mindfulness. And I would say that when we look at, and also I can confirm this in conversation with Jon Kabat-Zinn, when we actually look at the 7 features of mindfulness listed by Jon Kabat-Zinn and think about it in terms of that heuristic, we'll see that, in fact, MBSR is non-dual primarily. And the way that Jon has expressed it to me is that its sort of core, its attitude is Zen, if you like, and that it employs techniques that are drawn from the Theravada tradition. So like so many traditions that have emerged in the past in Buddhism, and also so much of modernity, it's a hybrid. And it's a very, in some cases, very useful hybrid. In brief then, for this first heuristic, what we need is to keep styles of mindfulness distinct in terms of their traditions, theories, histories, texts, and techniques. And the heuristic of classical and non-dual styles is one means of doing so, and then understanding how they've been combined in the modern context. Now, a second heuristic I want to talk about is actually one here. We are not drinking vodka. That is just water, unfortunately. But this is actually taken last fall when we were in the throes of completion, which took us another 6 months of this very long manuscript that we worked on for a couple of years. We, meaning Cliff, Amishi, myself, and Antoine Lutz. And the title of this manuscript is Investigating the Phenomenological Matrix of Mindfulness-Related Practices from a Neurocognitive Perspective. And very briefly, what this model is about is it's based on a variety of sources, including modern and pre-modern meditation manuals, theoretical materials from within Buddhism, modern manuals that are not at all Buddhist, and interviews and first-person observation. The model identifies the phenomenological features characterizing various mindfulness styles and stages of development that are most relevant to research on formal practice. And I'm going to go very quickly through that model. We're going to identify some features that essentially we're going to say that all the various versions of mindfulness, when we're trying to understand their phenomenology, as one piece in understanding what's going on in mindfulness, I see this as very much compatible with what both Bob and Evan were speaking about. This is just one piece in a larger picture. There's a way of characterizing different styles of mindfulness along certain phenomenological dimensions that I'll discuss. It's developed specifically as a tool for hypothesis generation when we're trying to understand what's happening during formal practice. What are practitioners doing during formal practice, and how might that affect them? How might it, for example, one of the issues that I'm most interested in is how might it enable them to enact, if you like, a particular kind of worldview or a particular kind of social identity? Are there styles of mindfulness that are better for certain types of persons for them to reconceive themselves with different kinds of identities? So it's not just about realizing the nature of reality. To my mind, it may very well be, and also historically for Buddhism, very much be about transforming the person and, in a sense, inculcating a particular kind of identity. And this model, of course, is understood as a heuristic or teaching device. It's non-exhaustive, it's provisional, it's subject to refinement and reconfiguration. And we hope that it will be reconfigured and revised considerably as time goes on. So here's basically how we've worked out the model. And these conversations, as I say, began quite a while ago and has gone through many iterations. But we always started in some ways with a kind of a space that we're going to represent different points, different styles, or excuse me, different phenomenological states, if you like, within a particular space. And that space is already assumed. So we have a model here that's going to talk about the phenomenology of formal practice. It already assumes a larger context that includes physical posture, that one of the common elements across different styles of mindfulness seems to be the need for a non-aversive stance. Some styles will emphasize something like kindness or compassion. Others will emphasize devotion. Others don't speak directly in affective terms, but seem to assume that you have to be at least non-aversive. It also assumes an axiological framework of values and so on. And it also assumes that there's a kind of task set retention. I'm not going to go into these contextual factors. You've heard a lot about context. The model assumes that one has an account of the context in which this formal practice is occurring. And then the three dimensions that form the three-dimensional space of the cube here are, first of all, object orientation. The degree to, so if one is at a zero orientation, one would not be focusing on objects at all. This may be only a theoretical 0 point. And part of what's interesting about the space is asking how much of this space would have to actually be empty. And going up to the maximal value, you are maximally focused on objects. Now, this doesn't mean you're necessarily currently selecting an object. It can also mean that your orientation is toward objects. So even in a style of practice called choiceless awareness, you can still be waiting in a sense. You can be attending toward the contents of awareness as they are arising, so you would still have some degree of object orientation in that type of practice. A de-reification is the term that we've decided to use because we thought it was maybe a little more descriptive, but it occurs in many different ways in the literature. You'll hear of decentering, of cognitive insight, of mindful awareness, and so on and so forth, of cognitive diffusion. And this basically means the degree to which the contents of your awareness, especially your thoughts, are being presented not as representations, but just as mental events. So, for example, if I'm meditating and I suddenly find myself on the beach in the Bahamas, the moment in which I realize that that representation, that in a sense, that grounded full-body simulation of being on the beach in the Bahamas, the moment I realize that that is just a mental event is the moment of de-reification. And of course, that moment is a very powerful one. For various reasons, especially because essentially it destroys the salience of that representation for the agent who is engaged in enjoying the beach on the Bahamas. Therefore, it dissipates. So that's one of the features of de-reification, what the Tibetans call self-liberation. Meta-awareness is a complex dimension here that we're trying to connect it to. We had a long discussion about this, and I won't start the discussion again. But this is very closely related to what we have decided to call background awareness, which is the capacity to be aware of features of your phenomenal experience that are off the object without turning them into objects. So, for example, if you're beholding a beautiful sunset, you turn around and I ask you how you felt. You don't have to turn back to the sunset and then introspect and then say, oh, now I know how I felt. Because that was an intense affective experience, you are able to give some kind of report about your feelings, even though you were not making yourself an object at the time. You were not introspecting in the sense of turning inward. So we're very interested in this background awareness as a feature of the overall meta-awareness capacity that seems to be trained in all versions of mindfulness. And then there are 4 other qualities that each point in the cube represents. So this is like a weather map where you can represent multiple dimensions within a single space. One of them is the aperture of your focus. You have a very narrow focus. For example, you focus just on the sensations of breathing right here? Or do you have a very wide focus? Are you literally taking open sky, for example, as your object? The degree of clarity, the phenomenal intensity of the experience. Is it dull? Is it unclear? Or is it very bright? The metaphors of light are often appropriate here. The stability of that phenomenological experience. The sense, in other words, phenomenological stability simply means the sense in which this is going to continue on into the next moments. There's more to be said, but no time. Effort. If these These are ranging from, of course, narrow to broad. This is from unclear to clear. This is unstable to very stable. And here we have effort is ranging from very little effort to a lot of effort. And using this then, these 7 dimensions, we can, or these 7 features, we can plot different kinds of, we can have what you might call phenomenological plots. Again, this is a heuristic. This is a way of pointing to certain features of an experience. It's not an exhaustive account of any experience, obviously. So if we talk about addictive craving, addictive craving is very sharply focused in a narrow aperture on its object, whatever that might be. It does not require much effort. It feels very stable, and it is very phenomenally intense. Rumination and mind wandering, for example. Mind wandering is a state that has almost no effort. Oh, I forgot, excuse me. In terms of addictive craving, it's not at all dereified. It takes its object. If I crave strawberries and I'm thinking of a strawberry, I think that thought of a strawberry really is a strawberry. So my dereification is very low. I'm very highly focused on an object, and I'm not really aware of this process. I'm somewhat aware of it, but I'm not very aware of it. Whereas in rumination, I can be quite aware of my ruminative thinking, but I still can take it as real, as true. As I'm running the ruminative script, I believe the ruminative script to be true, so I don't have a high degree of dereification. There's some maybe moderate level of effort, but still not very much, and again, high degree of intensity generally, and stability. So these are just examples of some ordinary states that we wanted to plot to give examples of how they would contrast with some of the meditative styles that one would try to plot into this space. We're going to use here, we have used also in the article, which is under review and hopefully will be approved shortly. We talked about again, another heuristic of what we call focused attention meditation, which would characterize a large number of meditative styles that are seeking to develop high degrees of concentration. A novice in focused attention would find that their capacity, for example, to focus very sharply on the breath here would be, this would be a narrow aperture, is typical of focused attention. It would have a low degree of stability, a high amount of effort, not much clarity. The dereification capacity would need to be there theoretically because we believe that most mindfulness styles of actual meditation practice deploy some degree of dereification as a means of dropping distractors. So that when a distractor occurs, a distracting thought, that one of the main techniques for use across different styles of practice, one of the main techniques for dropping distractors is to realize that the thought is just a thought. And that enables you to drop the distractor and return to the object. So dereification would be relatively high. However, the capacity to monitor that state through meta-awareness would be relatively low. Whereas the expert would have much less effort, higher degree of clarity, much more readily can dereify distractors, and has a higher degree of meta-awareness. This contrasts then with open monitoring practice. And open monitoring practice would be styles of practice that, for example, would involve simply surveying the field of consciousness or field of awareness, whatever is arising in experience. This could be called an open monitoring practice. Choiceless awareness on this account could be called an open monitoring practice. Some of the styles of mindfulness that are called the mindfulness of mere non-distraction, or Mayang Samgidjempa, would also fall into this category. And open monitoring as a novice would again involve more effort, would be unclear, would be unstable. But as you would see, the meta-awareness would in fact be increased relative to the novice because the style of instruction that is given in this case is deliberately trying to augment meta-awareness. The expert in open monitoring would have much greater clarity, much greater stability, much less effort, and the maximal amount of meta-awareness in principle. Now, of course, these plots are really just, in a sense, our imagination. They're also based, to some extent, on our own phenomenological observations. They're based on interviews. But really what needs to come next is some kind of an approach for gathering phenomenological data. And that's one of the big issues that I think faces the field right now, is once we have a tool, or whether it's this or something else, that enables us to really start to parse what practitioners are doing when they are meditating, we also now need a means to gather that data, if you like, about what they are doing when they are meditating. And of course, some of that is not phenomenological data. It's about posture. What kind of posture are they assuming? Are they engaged in certain kinds of movements during formal meditation practice? Might there even be some kind of subvocalization that occurs during formal meditation practice? These are things that we can observe. But we also need methods for developing, for collecting the phenomenological data that will characterize that. And this is really what this project depends upon, whether it will be something like elicitation, developed by Claire Petit-Mongin and Michel Bitbol, or is it going to be something else? In order for this project to succeed, we have to be able to gather that kind of data. And if we can't gather that kind of data, then that indicates that maybe barking up the phenomenological tree is really the wrong thing to do. We also have to test the model through experimental designs and tasks relevant to each dimension. And then we need to modify and repeat, endlessly, probably. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We have time for about 5 minutes of questions. Was that all clear? There was no question?
Yes, since I basically gave you 2 talks, it was quite a lot of material all at once.
Any questions?
In terms of measurement, I can imagine in terms of the practitioner, because we're talking about practice, there's the supposed understanding by the practitioner of what that practice should result in.
Right.
Which is a whole set of pre-practice conceptions, training, what a teacher has told you, what you've read, which will influence the measurement of these different constructs by the practitioner, by him or her, immediately after a given practice.
That's
when
right.
They reflect back retrospectively, just moments ago, how stable was my attention? How clear was the image? What was the size of the aperture? So there's it's complex.
It's complex. So they're actually, in a way, and these plots in a way represent the ideal target states for these practices. And part of what we would want to gather from practitioners is their own conceptualization of what those ideal target states are. Because those could easily vary. I think most meditation teachers know that you say one thing and it's heard 3 different ways by 3 different people. So understanding what they think the target states are is one. Another, however, is using a method that can get at the phenomenology. So what's interesting about the explicitation method, it's very labor intensive, it takes a lot of time, but to the extent I understand it, it tries to bypass what the person thinks happened and actually probes them in a way that begins to reveal more about the phenomenology. It's not simply that I thought I saw something, or that I think that this is a square, but actually when I look at it, it's not a square, it's not a rectangle from your perspective. It looks different than a rectangle. So actually describing the visual, what's being presented to you visually, for example, requires suspending our usual way of saying, oh, this is a rectangle. It's not a rectangle to you at that angle, right? So that type of a method is a method that has to get, in a sense, at the implicit phenomenology of the experience through work with the practitioner. Interviewing is obviously one method. There may be other methods. And I'm not sure that at this point we have, and if anyone has any suggestions along those lines, I'd be happy to hear about it later. I know in phenomenological psychology they developed some methods, but I really haven't seen much yet.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm really glad that you brought up, I guess, a phenomenological approach, because that brings in an element that we haven't had brought up before. And I just had a question, like, what have you thought about the fact that there's some level on which, when you're explaining your concepts and your ideas, that you kind of have to depend on the audience to somehow have some kind of correspondence in their own experience, so that they can make sense of, like, what is a narrow focus and what is a broad focus.
Yes, right. So
your own work kind of depends on a prior phenomenological investigation. Let's put it that way.
That's correct. So you could say that part of what this process involved is something that is a concept in the phenomenological tradition, which is a kind of examining the intersubjective variation among individuals, engaging in an intensive conversation around the nature of various experiences, and trying to come up with ways of describing those experiences along dimensions that we can agree upon. So there's a very long, the background here is a long conversation among ourselves, a conversation with others, and also a kind of implicit conversation with textual sources as well. I mean, there are problems with using textual sources as phenomenological accounts, but to some degree they're reliable. So yes, really, in a sense, this is the product of a conversation, and I understand that conversation to be ongoing, and hence this whole model is subject to revision. It's a place to start.